We're delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Alan Borthwick, Head of Medieval and Early Modern Records at NRS. In today's talk, he will discuss how NRS staff and their predecessors have cared for the Declaration of Arbroath over the past 200 years in the Curation of the Declaration of Arbroath. Over to you, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa, for that introduction. I'm delighted to have been given the opportunity to make this presentation today on behalf of all my colleagues at National Records of Scotland. In my talk today, I will cover the story of my office's curation of the only surviving sealed original of the Declaration of Arbroath. This talk is therefore about the document, not about the content and its interpretation, on which there are many others better able than me to talk. It is work in progress since, as others have found, research has been difficult because of the closure of or restriction on access to archives in the past 16 months, even with the welcome changes that have happened in recent months. I assume that everyone attending this talk will have had at least a little knowledge about the Declaration of Arbroath. In other words, it's a letter dated 6 April 1320, sent by a variety of Scottish barons to the Pope, seeking his support in their struggle to prevent the King of England from making good his claim to have lordship over Scotland, and expressing their support for King Robert I as rightful King of Scotland. The letter sent to the Pope has long been lost, but what is seen as the Scottish file copy has been preserved, and it's seen as the most treasured document held by my office. I realized just now when I was just looking back over my presentation that because this particular presentation is a revised one of one that I gave a little while ago, I haven't actually got an illustration of the file copy, the one that we preserve of the declaration, available at this point in the presentation. It will appear later. I hope that you can imagine what it looks like. Perhaps you've seen our website feature on the declaration or are familiar with it in some other context. Curation of the declaration involves securing it in our storage areas so as to preserve it for posterity, but also making it available somehow or another, which for a document as fragile as this is exceptionally difficult. The usual conflict between preservation and access. I thought I'd include this slide as one of the starting points of the presentation, as all of us on our staff are accustomed to use a variety of acronyms for our buildings in particular, and that also extends for many of us to the declaration itself. Hopefully, if you're not already used to some of the acronyms, you'll become familiar in the course of this talk. So in particular, I'm likely to just use the acronyms for our buildings and also for the declaration. In July 1829, the 9th Earl of Haddington wrote to us, that is NRS as we are now, to say that he would give effect to his late father's desire that the letter of the Scotch nobles to the Pope, as he put it, be sent to us. That's the Earl of Haddington's late father. This is the conclusion of the well-known tale of how the first Earl of Haddington, who had briefly been Lord Clerk Register in 1612, had removed some of the records from the then Register House in Edinburgh Castle to his own home at Tinningham, while repair work was in train at the castle. The first Earl was a lawyer and a politician, and was a keen transcriber of a wide variety of official records. The documents he gathered at his home, Tinningham, were only gradually restored to what we now call the National Archives by his successors. This slide shows the main illustrations of the document that I will refer to in the talk and show images, starting from the earliest, which I'll be talking about shortly in Anderson's Diplomata, right through to the new photographs that we took for our postponed 2020 exhibition, this expected 700th anniversary exhibition, those photographs being taken towards the end of 2019. Although I began with the talk today with our recovery of the Declaration of Arbroath in 1829, there is an important prehistory, if you like, which should be recounted. The earliest printed Latin text of the Declaration in the 1680s by George Mackenzie of Rosehoch and Bishop Burnet used the original document as the source, with credit given to the Earl of Haddington as its custodian. The earliest known printed illustration of the Declaration itself is one of 180 engravings in the remarkable book by James Anderson, an Edinburgh lawyer and historian, conventionally known as Diplomata Scotiae. It was published in 1739, 11 years after Anderson's death. Work had been in progress on it since about 1706. As the title page obviously has a much longer version of the title than the very much abbreviated one, which is commonly used by historians. Anderson was praised for a critical response to publications in England reviewing the history of Anglo-Scottish relations and obtained financial support from the Scottish Parliament for something much more ambitious, what would eventually become the Diplomata. His hope was to collect and engrave all available medieval Scottish charters and seals within a volume. A contemporary of Anderson, John Slezer, for whom Anderson acted as legal agent, also obtained a grant from the Scottish Parliament for his work, the Theatrum Scotiae. This also contained many engravings. Like Anderson, however, Slezer struggled to get payment of his grant. The Diplomata would be extraordinary, even if published today. There were 5 internal parts to it: engravings of charters and seals, examples of letter shapes, examples of letter shapes from charters, words which are commonly found abbreviated in charters, gold and silver Scottish coins from the earliest times to the present, and heroic symbols, as they're called, of Scottish monarchs. Prior to Anderson's work, published engravings of documents were very unusual indeed, presumably because of the expense, but also the difficulty of getting hold of the documents that perhaps historians might have wanted. In 1736, a broadside advert for the publication, that's Anderson's Diplomata, said that the cost of subscribers would be 6 guineas, £6, 6 shillings. I've used the National Archives UK online calculator to convert the 6 guineas price of the book into a modern value, and it might be in real terms about £750 nowadays. I've noticed, though, that it's possible to buy a new scanned and bound copy of the Diplomata for about £20 now. Not necessarily the same size as the original edition, of course, but I'm not quite sure, as I haven't got my own version of this. I have used a free online and scanned version as the source for the last few slides. It is mostly usable, but the large-scale engravings, such as that of the DOA, haven't come out well at all. So I'm not quite sure about whether the version that you can buy for your £20 or £30 also has that particular drawback. Anderson borrowed the DOA from Lord Haddington to have the engraving completed. The only damage visible on the document itself at this stage is a small area on the right-hand side, as against what its current condition, which we'll see in a slide later on. This loss of text is also commented on in the transcript in Burnet's history. It's thought that this damage was the result of rodents. The representation of the seals on the DOA is the only unsatisfactory part of the engraving. Only one seal is shown, that of Duncan, Earl of Fife, a seal which is no longer present on the document. The small circles adjacent are supposed to indicate that 39 other seals still existed. That's the little chains of circles just on at the bottom of the depiction on the slides. So there are 39 of these. Now, did that actually mean that at this time when the engraving was made, that all 39 seals still existed? you must admit it does seem to me slightly unlikely, because seals are the part of a document most easily damaged. I'm not quite sure whether it will be possible to come to a conclusive answer to this particular problem now. I suspect that the sources that might just tell us about this just no longer exist. It is commonly thought within my office that the engraver of this DOA plate was Isaac Bessier, one member of a long-lived family of engravers. I am very doubtful about this on the basis of the research that I've carried out. The majority of the Diplomata plates were definitely engraved by John Sturt, the London engraver, or by those in his workshop. So I'm assuming that it is much more likely that the engraver of the plate for the Diplomata was John Sturt. NRS holds 87 of the copperplate engravings, including the one of the DOA. The quality of the work is extremely high. How the engravers managed it when using candlelight or natural light to do their work, I can barely imagine. It is in effect a 2D image, a contrast with the next engraving a century later. This particular slide just shows the area where the seal is engraved. I am aware that it's probably quite difficult to make out what's an engraving, which of course is reversed, but it is actually very difficult to take a good photograph of a copperplate engraving because of just the way that the plate may have suffered a little bit of damage over the years, and just the any light which you have got, which is casting, which will eventually cast a bit of shadow in at the wrong place at the wrong time, just when you're trying to get a good photo. As mentioned earlier, the Earl of Haddington sent the declaration to Register House in 1829. The foundation stone of General Register House was laid in 1774, but delays in its completion meant that it was only in the 1790s that it began to be occupied by records and staff. Lord Frederick Campbell, the Lord Clerk Register, had some part to play in encouraging Lord Haddington to restore state documents to the National Archive. Lord Frederick's deputy, Thomas Thompson, was the one who was really in charge of the office. Under Thompson, records began to be collected, sorted, conserved, and indexed. Not everything Thomas Thompson did was correct, but we still owe much to him. He was keen on developing a scheme to collect and print the acts of the pre-1707 Scottish Parliament, and it was in that context that he pursued the declaration to include an engraving of it in the first of the 12-volume edition of the Acts, the title page there of the first volume. Thompson had in fact already secured for a modest price as many of the copper plates for the Diplomata engravings as he could acquire. He reckoned, though, that a new engraving of DOA would be necessary. The evidence about the date of this new engraving is a little confusing. Hence, my current dating of it as being completed sometime between 1815 and 1822, even though it was not actually published until 1844. What we think is that the engraver for this new engraving, as I'm going to term it, was asked to engrave the document as he now found it. In other words, with those seals as then extant. We showed 21 of them. But those of you who are familiar with the current state of the document will notice that there is no major damage to the text, and we think therefore that the damage now seen must have occurred after this engraving was made. In this engraving, the background has been coloured in an effort to represent the curl and folds of the document. In other words, it's much more of a 3D image than the rather 2D image of the Anderson Diplomata engraving. NRS also holds the copperplate engraving used for the printing of this version. There is a view that the engraver reused the Diplomata plate but added on as new work a depiction of the tags and the seals. I'm not quite sure of this, but I'm not well informed about the engraving process, so that I can't really tell how practicable an approach like that would be. There are certainly differences, albeit small, between the engravings of the Diplomata and of the APS, the Acts of the Parliaments of Scotland engraving, with, for example, one clear error in the Diplomata engraving corrected. It is of a little interest that at the same time as Thomas Thompson commissioned the DOA engraving for the Acts of the Parliaments of Scotland volume, in the USA, the earliest engravings were being made of the American Declaration of Independence. The best of them is what is known as the Stone engraving, named after its engraver William Stone. It's thought that the signatures on the Declaration, the American Declaration, were subject to a press copy process to obtain a true representation of them. It involves pressing damp paper against the original document to obtain a mirror image required for the engraving. This process, if used, would contribute to the deterioration of the original. There is no reason to think that this happened for the DOA engravings. It is this stone engraving which those of you who saw a story on the BBC and elsewhere about 3 weeks ago, I think it was, may have seen that the stone engraving, a copy of the stone engraving, was sold at auction in the United States of America for some vast sum, multiple millions of dollars. That particular engraving having been found in an attic in a Scottish home, as I understand. The next image in date terms is what's called a photosyncrograph, included in the second volume of the facsimiles of the National Manuscripts of Scotland, published in 1868. Photosynchrography was a process developed for creating multiple copies of maps by Sir Henry James of the Ordnance Survey from the late 1850s. The image that you can see shows the OS photography building. Sir Henry persuaded the UK government that photosynchrography could be used to make copies of archived documents available to as wide a public as possible at no great expense. In other words, extending the work that they were doing for reproducing Ordnance Survey maps to make it usable as well for just archived documents of some form, in particular, what we would now call the treasures of the National Archives across the UK. In some ways, this is similar, what they were proposing to do, to a modern digitization program. Financial support was provided for volumes for England, Scotland, and Ireland. Because the photography had to be done when the sun was strong to get the best image, it was a difficult process. A good run of fine weather was essential. Zinc plates were used to obtain an accurate impression of the document by transferring an image from a photographic negative, and then multiple prints could be made from the plate. In theory, this would all be done relatively cheaply. Our office agreed to transfer a number of documents to Southampton to allow the work to be undertaken from 1865 over the next couple of years. From contemporary reports, it's known that completing the photo of the declaration was found to be difficult. As I mentioned in one report of the seal tags being, and I quote, so fragile with age as to be barely capable of bearing their weight and vibrating with the least breath of air. That's the photosynchrography image that was created as a result of the work. There is a curious feature of the photosynchrograph. On this slide, what I've done is to highlight the lower right-hand side of the photo. Overall, it shows the same 21 seals as on the APS, the Acts of the Parliaments of Scotland engraving, completed 50 years before, but one seal appears in an entirely different place in the photo as compared to the engraving. Currently, I have no explanation for how this could have happened. The present state of the document mirrors as best as possible that of the APS engraving. For the first time in an illustration, we see the well-known damage, significant damage to DOA. There are variant accounts of how the DOA was treated when it was at Tinningham in the custody of the Earls of Haddington. Possibly the most authoritative account that I know of is an account of a visit to GRH, Generester House, in 1862 by Grant Duff, the Liberal MP for the Elgin boroughs. His guide was staff member Joseph Robertson, a widely respected historian who became what we would now call our deputy keeper. Robertson told Duff that the declaration was, I quote, discovered in front of a fireplace in a bathroom at Tinningham, the housemaid having been pleased with the long strips of parchment from which the seals depended, and thinking that it would make as good a great ornament as another. Given Robertson's official position in SRO, NRS, and the story being only 30 years since the declaration returned from Tinningham, maybe it has merit from an oral history perspective. Our view is that it's damp that has caused DOA the worst of the damage that has occurred. The significant hole evident in DOA has not, as far as I know, increased in size since 1867. Our curation of the declaration is not just an account of how we attempted to broaden knowledge of it by creating illustrations for publication. It is a reasonable guess that the DOA was most likely on display in GRH, or at the very least readily available to view for much of the 19th century. The illustration here of the historical search room in GRH in, as I assume, the 1880s shows some display cases. A report on a visit to the building published in 1830 referred to a few documents being exhibited in glass cases as if a display of treasures was normal even then. But I don't think that at that stage it's likely that the DOA was on display. I think there were other documents that were at that stage being shown in the display cases. We have no evidence for what happened thereafter in terms of whether the DOA was on display, but I think that it's a pretty fair assumption that it was regularly on show to visitors to GRH, Register House. 19 seals were recorded as being present in 1920, the same as now, so 2 had unfortunately been lost between the photosyncrograph in 1867 and then. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 required us to move records from GRH to a more secure place in the country. The obvious risk is thought being the possibility of bombs landing in Edinburgh city centre. And it was thought that it would be much more sensible to move some of the most treasured records, but also some of the most important records that were held in GRH to a place much less likely to suffer bombing damage. Their home, of those of the real treasures, became a safe in an office in Oban Sheriff Court. The Sheriff Clerk was very pleased at this, as their arrival made it possible for him to obtain official approval for the installation of a telephone in his office, an application for which had previously been refused. He would obviously therefore be able to use the phone to summon help if there was a particular incident. And it is very much a sign of the times looking back, just imagining that how difficult it must have been for the Sheriff Clerk Depute to have carried out his work without there being a telephone in his office at all. Many other national records were moved as well, ending up at Moornish in Perthshire, but they were all returned safely in 1945. Greater interest in the DOA in general during the early or mid-20th century brought our first known request for its loan for exhibition. Arbroath asked if it could be loaned during the 600th anniversary commemorations in 1920, and there was a further request in 1934, but both were turned down. Glasgow Art Gallery and Museum submitted a request for an exhibition loan in 1946. This was again refused. The requests were declined not because of the evident fragility of the document, but because our then senior staff stated that no document could be loaned for any purpose without the approval of the Scottish courts. And even if that were obtained, would have to be in the custody of a staff member at all times. This is a reminder of how our connection to the Scottish legal system was then deemed paramount. It was possible to view records for historical research in our search room, but our principal purpose was to be custodians of some of the long-running legal registers, such as the Sazen registers, and provide access thereto. This general refusal of requests for loans for exhibition of documents in our custody changed probably because more exhibitions began to feature documents and because we now received requests for loans of documents from deposited collections of which we were custodians, rather than the collections of records which were regarded as public records, which we owned. Individual documents like the Declaration would have certainly been seen as a public record. And we couldn't really refuse those requests for an exhibition loan if the collection owner agreed. The 1937 Public Records Scotland Act of Parliament, which is was our guiding legislation for many decades, did not give us express powers to lend records, but importantly did not prevent us from doing so. Our senior staff therefore decided that we could lend public records for exhibitions if a proposed loan took full account of the physical condition of the documents. After the Second World War, we established what was called a museum for an exhibition of some of our treasures. The problem is that GRH, which was then our only building, was not designed to include an exhibition space. The museum had to be located on the first floor of the main dome, which is in the photo here. In this photo, the permanent exhibition, as it was called, was to the right of the portraits, and we think that the case containing DO8 was the first one after the repository staffer on the ladder on the right-hand side of the image. The cases to the left of the portrait were for temporary exhibitions. It's definitely not an ideal exhibition space, as you can see. It's a very narrow walkway round, but we continue to use it, in fact, until around about 18 years ago, I think it was, for more or less annual summer exhibitions. The museum was still in place at the time of the Declaration's 650th anniversary exhibition that we hosted in 1970. The exhibition lasted for 6 months and attracted almost 4,000 visitors. I've not at the moment been able to find a photograph of that 650th anniversary exhibition, unfortunately. That anniversary, though, also saw the release of a special commemorative postage stamp by the post office. So James Ferguson's book about the Declaration, the first book dedicated to it, was published then. It included as a facsimile the earliest modern photo of the document taken in 1968. So James Ferguson was the keeper of the records of Scotland, the head of our office, in other words, from 1949 to 1969. So his book is almost our official history of the DOA. In 1971, we opened West Register House in Charlotte Square as our second building, given the acute shortage of storage space. Our museum was transferred to WRH in an exhibition space which was immediately off the entrance. The permanent exhibition housed there will be an expanded version of our long-running Treasures one from GRH, and it was in place for around about 20 years. The image which I show here shows the successor to that permanent exhibition, but the same cases were used for it. The Declaration was housed in one of the wall cases to the left, I think it is, of the cases on the left-hand side of the image. It's a difficult space to take photographs of, hence it's why I don't think we have it, that I'm aware of, any photographs of the exhibition space prior to around about 2000, but I may be wrong there. The Declaration was taken back to GRH a couple of times for other displays after 1971, one occasion including a display for the 650th anniversary of the death of Robert I in 1979, which was apparently a very well attended exhibition. The case containing the declaration is very similar in appearance to the one in the 1880s image of the historical search room that I showed earlier. Not all that easy to see, I know, in this scan of this particular newspaper cutting, but it is actually quite recognizable. It's a display case that we actually still have, though of course unused now, and so I'm guessing that it could therefore be well over 150 years old. The Treasures exhibition, including the declaration, was dismantled in 1992, but it didn't mean that this was the end of its exhibition history. The opening of the new Scottish Parliament building proved to be an unexpected catalyst for display in its entrance hall or undercroft. The Parliament building was not designed with a public exhibition space in mind, so there was some concern that holding an exhibition there with such an iconic document might disrupt normal business. The 4-week exhibition in August-September 2005 was a success as far as we're aware, with I think it's around 40,000 visitors logged as having been present. Amongst the more unusual visitors was King Robert I, depicted here closer to the declaration. He's been for almost 700 years. The Arbroath Pageant Society asked permission to have a special visit to the exhibition one evening, which was granted. And this individual is one of the members of the Pageant Society, as you can see, dressed as King Robert I. Thereafter, we continued investigation of the declaration's past and present, and the best means of securing its future. In 2010, we produced a web feature about the declaration, including this page about the sealers of the declaration using photographs that we had taken for that 2005 exhibition. Educational resources aimed at school and adult learners were also being developed. Thoughts now began to turn to this upcoming 700th anniversary, which would have been 2020. We were keen to have an exhibition, but the venue was the principal issue, alongside the inevitable matter of resources, both staff and finance. The clear conclusion was that we could not ourselves host an exhibition, and we were pleased that we secured an agreement for the National Museum of Scotland to host a display in spring 2020 on our behalf. Inevitably, alas, overtaken by events. That's the external banner just outside the museum, which was still up, I think, in June 2020, I think it was, when I took this slide, a long time after most of Edinburgh streets had fallen silent. We intend to reschedule the exhibition, and in due course information will be made available. In preparation for the exhibition, a new suite of photographs was taken. Conservation work beforehand included straightening out of the seal tags. I was very surprised to see that some names on seal tags, formerly hidden in their crease state, were now visible. The names of 2 barons, hitherto unknown as those associated with the declaration, that is, whether they were named in the document address clause, named on seal tags, or be their seals, now appeared. One of the newly revealed names is on this image. It says J. Gifford. A feature about this was issued on our blogspot about 2 months ago. This is a reminder of the critical role of my conservator colleagues in the curation of the declaration. Parchment responds to changes in humidity by expanding, contracting, and curling, and it's difficult to keep it flat in an exhibition case or frame. In the 19th century, the impact on a document of prolonged display was not understood. Uncontrolled environmental conditions would have been normal. The damaging effect of excess light and ink is now appreciated, but it cannot be undone. It's well understood now that the American Declaration of Independence has faded through being displayed continuously for many decades in the 19th century. For decades, our conservators have used their experience and contacts to enhance and improve our knowledge of the physical characteristics of the Declaration. Perhaps the culmination of that was our commissioning something that many of us had long wished for. the creation of true-to-life facsimiles of the Declaration. Our conservators had long had contact with a Czech conservator and craftsman who had produced some remarkable facsimiles of Czech documents, as well as doing some work for us. We settled on the commission of our facsimile as is, in other words, showing the Declaration in its current state, and one as was, that is, in the state that we think it was when the APS, the Acts of the Parliament of Scotland engraving, was created around about 1815. The photo here shows the two facsimiles in an advanced state of preparation. The quality of these facsimiles is quite outstanding. They were delivered to us shortly before the lockdown last spring, and one is to be gifted for display in Arbroath. After the last 15 months, none of us know what the future may hold, but I, for one, hope that our successors as conservators and archivists, perhaps at the time of the 750th anniversary display in 2070, will look kindly on us for the work we have undertaken in recent decades to maintain the balance of preservation of and access to what is Scotland's most iconic document. Thank you very much.